My name is Johanna Christensen. I teach theology at the Faculty of Theology and represent the Faculty of Theology in the Gender Coordination. It is a great joy to present and introduce to you today Professor Andrea C. White from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. Professor White is Associate Professor of Theology and Culture, and she is also Executive Director of the Society for the Study of Black Religion, and is a founding member of the Carter Center Scholars in Action, which addresses gender-based violence against women and girls. Professor White specializes in constructive Christian theology, especially womanist theology and postmodern religious thought. She has received numerous fellowships, grants, and has been awarded for her research, culminating in a forthcoming volume, The Scandal of the Flesh, Black Women's Bodies and God Politics. She's also the author of The Back of God, A Theology of Otherness in Karl Barth and Paul Ricoeur. I've been looking so much forward to your lecture today, and I'm happy to give you the microphone. Welcome.
Thank you so much. How's my mic? Volume okay? Mm-hmm. I have the really noble task of keeping you awake at the end of the conference. But I'm really delighted to be here. It's a thrill and a joy. I still have a vivid memory in my mind of when Johanna invited me to come, and I didn't have to look at my calendar, I didn't have to check with my children, I just absolutely said yes. But I want to also thank Hilda Christensen along with Johanna Christensen for the opportunity to be here. It's really a joy to be here. Whether we are philosophers or theologians, critical theorists, or social scientists, it seems we are inescapably preoccupied with Descartes' so-called incision of the human person. Apparently, the ills of modernity can be traced to Descartes' act of slicing the human being down the middle, separating the material half from the immaterial half, except the incision is usually thought of as a horizontal line at the neck rather than a vertical line at the middle. So depending on your angle of vision, the incision is either the result of or the antidote for contempt for the body. Of course, there's a debate about whether this well-known charge against Descartes is exegetically accurate, or whether it's even fair. So if we want to let Descartes off the hook, we can go back even further than Descartes, and of course, both Plato and Paul struggled against the body. Religion especially is engaged in activities of surveillance and regulation of the body. Flesh is the metaphor of the fallen person. Culpability for the rejection of God deemed irrational rests with the body and its distracting desires for pleasure. The body that's supposed to be hell. Fall into hell. The body is a threat to public stability, government, and civilized public. The body is dangerous if not controlled by cultural processes. There is, therefore, a Christian duty, a religious duty to master the flesh. Bataille says, flesh is the extravagance within us set up against the law of decency. Flesh is the born enemy of people haunted by Christian taboos. Taking her cue from Nietzsche's Insight and Critique, one feminist theologian contends that Christianity's inherent contempt for the body makes Christianity fundamentally nihilistic. Phenomenological description of the body is fecund for garnering insights about the always curious relation between religion and culture, a relation manifest in the cultural contradiction of capitalism. In his historical survey of the body in Western society, Brian Turner points out that discipline and asceticism are expected in the workforce, but hedonism and consumption are demanded in the household. In consumer culture, the body is a vehicle of pleasure. The consumer's gaze is bombarded by desirable and idealized images of youth, health, fitness, and beauty, driven by sexual desirability of the body. In popular culture, such an aesthetic is justification for life. In fact, the body, as a space for desire, has become, in its ideological function, an object of salvation. The narrative now becomes predictable. It is no wonder that the body has become central to discourses of cultural and political power and economic relations. If world mastery is the essential project of modernity, then an ethic of world mastery starts with control of the flesh. And it ends with not control of the self, but control of other bodies. This is the colonial and imperial project of empire. There's an ironic twist in the fact that the body deemed as ultimate origin of idolatry leads to the regulation and dehumanizing of other bodies. The solution to the problem that is the body becomes problematizing other bodies. In its efforts at mastery, the disembodied mind confronts the world and drives the empire by its obsessive preoccupation with exploiting bodies. The mind-body problem, it turns out, unveils the fantasy of bodies left behind. As one scholar jokes, reason, in fact, can at last divorce the unsatisfactory wife he has been complaining of since the 18th century and live comfortably forever among the boys, playing computer games in the solitude of space. Is that not touching? In her essay on philosophy and the body, Mary Midgley concludes, there is no set of perforations down the middle of the human being. So given these preliminary remarks about the tenacious body problem, the feminist and womanist preoccupation with the body seems a confused response. Womanist theology, by the way, is a young discipline of about 30 years, developed to treat lacunas in Black and feminist religious discourse. Black theology attends to race but not gender. Feminist theology attends to gender but not race. Womanist theology is a critique of both by foregrounding Black women's religious experience. It reads both race and gender oppression as theological problems. It grants hermeneutical privilege to Black women's experience, and it rejects wholesale any notion of redemptive suffering. Because of its critique of colorblind feminist thought, it would be a gross misunderstanding to construe womanism as a subset of feminism. It isn't. But returning to the question and the body problem, why have scholars foregrounded the body in their feminist and womanist work? One might argue that theorizing about Black women's bodies does not seem radical enough to oppose the discursive power of the dominant body narrative. A womanist response that foregrounds Black bodies seems an ill-conceived strategy that does little to resist persistent myth-making and the politics of representation. It critiques the fishbowl while remaining in the fishbowl, as Ratna Kapoor might put it, based on her comments yesterday. If the problem is that Black women's very humanity has been reduced to their exploited bodies, are we not returning black women's bodies to the auction block and reinforcing the breeder image that has come to define her? But we already know that the social construction critique is insufficient. Critical theory has persuasively demonstrated the unintended consequence of social construction's erasure of the body's materiality. Social construction reduces the body to a code or a metaphor of socio-cognitive mappings of reality. Given the binary nature of the Cartesian split, the slicing down the middle, or more precisely, the decapitation, it is critical that the womanist response does not invert the narrative, but rather subvert the narrative. I want to suggest that theology can actually help us reread the body problem in a surprisingly productive way. After all, as Derrida scholar John Caputo contends, only those who are unfamiliar with theology would be surprised to hear that theology is all about bodies, very corporeal bodies. The risen body is, in one way or another, theology's bottom line, he says, the final payoff of a certain strong theology, the sum and substance of its faith. Theologian Ian McFarland insists that the incarnation leads to a wholesale reevaluation of the significance of matter as a medium of knowledge of God. Insofar as the eternal image of God has taken flesh, the material cannot be regarded as an insurmountable barrier to knowledge of God. That as material beings, we cannot get along without material images. The risk that we will conform those images to our own sensibilities raises the question of how our imaging of God is to be kept from the ever-present temptation to idolatry. So maybe, just maybe, the womanist theologian is onto something when it comes to the phenomenal body problem. What is needed is a critical somatology that would avoid an objectification of the body. What is needed is an emancipatory materialism that also accounts for violent inscriptions on the body. Phenomenologist Jean-Luc Marion inverts the terms of the alterity question ubiquitous throughout the history of Western Christian thought, persistent in postmodern religious thought, when he identifies immanence as the significant problem of the other. The difficulty of the other, he says, lies not in its supposed distancing, poverty, or transcendence. It lies, on the contrary, in its absolute immanence. The scandal to thought, it turns out, is not radical alterity, but embodiment. This is not to say that transcendence and embodiment are oppositional, but to suggest that the tenacious preoccupation with transcendence has distracted theological attention from what is arguably a greater difficulty. The precarious nature of encounter with the other, even our vulnerability before the other, is not due to the inaccessibility of the abstract other, but to the immediacy of the flesh. The other appears, Jean-Luc Marion writes, indirectly and yet all the more immediately. On this view, when it comes to God, it is conceptually easier to contend with the notion that God is God than it is to grapple with God made flesh. If womanist theological anthropology is inherently a question of flesh, raced and gendered flesh, then it has taken on not a peripheral theological conundrum, but a paradigmatically theological question. When womanist theology takes on the question of flesh, it must negotiate the dialectic between the body as a site for ideological inscription and the body as a site for grace. Bodies are texts upon which ideologies are inscribed, and the black body especially is a cartography of power dynamics. Anthony Pinn describes such power relations as not simply thought, but performed through the placement of real fleshly bodies in space and time. The body is a story told to support the social system. In this regard, the body is not simply a biological material reality, but also a cultural production, subject to the conditions of a market economy. We know well the story of black women's bodies as objects of exchange in a slave economy. Katie Cannon, pioneer of womanist theological ethics, has this to say about black women's bodies as texts. Heteropatriarchs have worked out, have worked on, and have inscribed their death-dealing ideologies, theologies, and systems of value on the canvas that is the flesh of black people. Our bodies are the texts that carry the memories. The flesh of African American women is the text on which androcentric patriarchy is written. In a discussion of black women's subjectivity, Carol Boyce Davies writes, the subaltern woman is, as subject, is already positioned, represented, spoken for, or constructed as absent or silent or not listened to in a variety of discourses. Her speech is already represented as non-speech. Not only is her subjectivity an unspoken discourse, but the practice of ideological inscription upon the body also goes unnoticed and therefore remains uninterrogated. Pin accounts for such disregard by describing the nonverbal dimension of the body that renders bodies non-written texts. The body speaks a world without uttering a single word. It is through critique of ideological inscription that the body becomes a silent partner laid bare. The body as text, as that which is constricted by ideology, must be distinguished from embodied subjectivity as that which exceeds ideology. Here we have come up against a paradox. The simultaneous inscription of a symbol system upon the black female body as text, and the non-speech of her embodied subjectivity. The black female body is read but unwritten, inscribed but not spoken. This non-speech is the result of a violent act of coding as natural what is in fact distorted identity. Black women's identity seems inextricably bound to servanthood, surrogacy, and sacrifice, to the controlling images of Mammy, matriarch, welfare queen, and Jezebel, as black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins points out. But the solution is not so easily carried out, or for that matter, so obviously recognized. It is not simply a matter of speaking, of erasing ideological inscription in order to write another text. The desire to speak meets up with the paradoxical challenge of attempting to communicate what is incommunicable. The pain of evil and suffering that has been the mechanism of ideological inscription and subjective proscription in the first regard. A phenomenology of pain shows us the utter inexpressibility and cultural invisibility of dehumanization. But if black women's experience of suffering cannot be articulated, then her body becomes the black hole, so to speak, within and against which all interpretive discourse can only come to a halting stop. Removing the status of invisibility is prerequisite for demythologizing the image of black female bodies as icons of sexual deviance. Black women's bodies function as part of a pervasive yet largely uninterrogated cultural myth. As oversexed black women are always ready for sex, therefore sexual violence to the black female body is not logically possible. It does no injury to her, but rather the very presence of her seducing body does injury to men. As womanist scholar Kelly Brown Douglas contends, it is virtually impossible for black women to step out of the character of Jezebel. Does foregrounding oppression in womanist thought, whether in its overt or covert form, entail that womanist theology is inherently, or even exhaustively, a theology of suffering? Does this reductionistic view not further victimize black women by restricting identity to one of suffering and resistance, and therefore an identity in which the dominant white male gaze controls all there is to say in the matter? When womanist theology claims African American women's religious experience as a methodological starting point, and when it describes this experience as marked by the intersection of race and gender oppression, this ought not entail a fetishization of oppression. We do not wish to romanticize gender and race oppression. And neither do we wish to claim that oppression exhaustively defines black women's identity, which in itself would be a dehumanizing act. So the deconstructive task of identifying exclusion, marginality, exploitation, and violence cannot be all we have to say about black women's identities and bodies. As Stacey Floyd Thomas asserts, womanist identity must move beyond ontological blackness by recognizing that black subjectivity is not a static, reified artifact. Womanist identity allows for multiple performances of gender, race, and sexuality, always resisting totalization and closure. Moreover, to speak of black women and their bodies as gendered and racialized is not to suggest a lack of agency in the economy of social construction. Black women are not passive recipients of racialization and gendered identity constructions. Womanist theology must not perpetuate the victimization motif that renders her an essentialized object of study as an historical phenomenon. To talk about the grip of culture on the body casts active subjects as passive dupes of ideology and overlooks the gaps and the unstable and open nature of cultural texts. It is to fail to acknowledge the cultural work which fragmented active subjects confound dominant discourses. Racism and sexism are quotidian. So to foreground the concrete lived realities and everyday experience of black women's lives is to foreground the quotidian nature of these intersecting forms of oppression. I want to take seriously the womanist call to attend to the everyday experience, because it is everyday experience in particular that is infested with covert expressions of oppression, and therefore require disclosure. There is an assumption that liberal democratic governments do not have a public policy of discrimination, government-sanctioned politics of race, yet bell hooks contends imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, as she puts it, that's all one word, is internalized by almost everyone and shapes everything from our culture to our politics. When it comes to race, we are still prone to believe that racism is a black issue, and that internalized racism is a psychological condition and not a political problem or collective trauma. The reality of oppression in black women's experience, too real for those who experience it, is too often absent from the consciousness of those who do not. In fleeting moments of recognition, it is just as quickly dismissed. Heritage and history, the legacy of slaveocracy and lynching have all been erased, concealed, and rendered invisible by historical amnesia. Yet cultural practices are shaped by dispositions of the habitus and implicit ideologies that are largely uninterrogated. In other words, there is a learned ignorance, a mode of practical knowledge not comprising knowledge of its own principles. Cultural practices are the result of hidden socializations that become so commonplace and routine that they are barely recognizable because they are so insidiously embedded in the cultural milieu and in everyday thoughts and practices. The normal becomes naturalized, and the naturalized becomes invisible. The quotidian nature of oppression is of a piece with its accompanying denial and unwitting complicity. In her highly acclaimed book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, legal scholar Michelle Alexander explains the complexity of denial. When it comes to mass incarceration of poor, brown, and black bodies in the United States, prisons and the ghettos to which prisoners are released are literally hidden from sight, outside public view. Their invisibility serves an effortless denial. But the denial is also strenuously complicated by the fact that mass incarceration functions as a racial caste system, while it is officially colorblind. Race plays a major role in the way the system works, but if conceptions of the race problem conjure notions of violent acts of hatred and aggressive hostility, then something else quite different is at work. Alexander writes, the notion that racial caste systems are necessarily predicated on a desire to harm other racial groups, and that racial hostility is the essence of racism, is fundamentally misguided. At a systemic level, what has far more impact than social hostility is racial indifference. While racial hostility is unacceptable, not to mention illegal, racial indifference is not only legal, but may even be mistaken for honorable manifestations of justice. Racial indifference cultivates the myth of post-racial existence. The race problem is behind us. We've moved beyond it. This racial indifference is to be commended. The attitude of racial indifference as an acceptable form of denial is fueled by the inclusion of whites in the racial caste system. This inclusion has the strategic benefit, Alexander tells us, of protecting against the charge of racial hostility and sustains the myth of colorblindness. That poor whites are harmed in the process is merely a matter of collateral damage and helps to preserve the sanctity of the system. In short, the inclusion of some whites in the system of control, she writes, is essential to preserving the image of a colorblind criminal justice system and maintaining our self-image as fair and unbiased people. Racism has its instrumental function. Discrimination against brown and black bodies is hostile and violent, but it is often violent on its way to another purpose. It is a means to an end. Violence happens to be a critical piece in the broader teleological trajectory, but the chief aim, Alexander claims, is power and wealth. Not necessarily sadistic violence for the sake of hatred and hostility. The criminal justice system in the United States is no longer concerned primarily with the prevention and punishment of crime, but rather with the management and control of the dispossessed. Bell Hooks attests to the fact that while race talk may be more prevalent than ever before, some of us, she says, do not want to be heard sharing that we are sick and tired of talking about race. Discourse fatigue is no doubt a result of the fact that theorists are still engaged in the business of trying to persuade others that the problem exists and persists. It is a mark of the time that racism is invisible and is therefore left uninterrogated. Racism and sexism are often closeted, and that is what makes them the most dangerous. That they illicitly and secretly inform, if not undergird, structures of power. The cultural malaise is tied to the notion that black people have gained enough civil rights. Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey make the case. Thank you, Barack and Oprah. Economic uplift is the example par excellence. So the problem is exacerbated by mistakenly identifying the economic uplift of a small sample set as an indicator of freedom, pointing to the possibility of economic power as insufficient in itself to overcome the entire system of discrimination. Slavery, by the way, do you all get Oprah Winfrey showing? Do you know who she is?
No.
Okay. A U.S. cultural reference that I hoped would carry over. So So the idea is that slavery and lynching are a thing of the past, therefore racism is no longer a meaningful threat. We live in a post-racial society, so goes the myth of historical amnesia and colorblindness. It is ironic, as Woman Towns has pointed out, that postmodern religious thought celebrates otherness as an ethical category in order to mark human persons exterior to the self, at the precise historical moment in the US when African Americans and marginalized people of color were working to break free from the bonds of being othered. Do you see the irony? The proclamation that black women are made in the image of God is to put theological spin on the human quest for recognition. The quest is human insofar as we understand personhood as inherently intersubjective. Otherness is constitutive of selfhood, which is to say, I understand who I am insofar as I understand my relation to others. Relationality is not a supplement to personhood, but is thought of as integral to what it means to be human. The person lives in a world of other persons in time and space with a history and a cultural context. It's embodied lived experience. Entire theories of subjectivity have been formed around the thematization of relationality. But the womanist insight of intersectionality understands that relationality is not unencumbered. The womanist experience of triple consciousness understands that being in relation is not synonymous with solidarity. Relationality is plagued with dysfunction, domination, oppression, and violence to subjectivity. Relationality does not in itself imply mutual regard, flourishing, or any romanticized notion of communal identity. It is from this perspective that the paradox of recognition politics comes into view. Many theorists have pointed out that when oppressed groups seek recognition as an antidote to subjugated subjectivity, this quest for recognition stands in paradoxical relation with, if not direct opposition to, the reality that recognition is sought from the very persons who have denied humanity in the first place. In this sense, the quest for recognition paradoxically serves to undergird the very system of domination one is seeking to overturn. The valuation of recognition relies on the premise that equality is an ideal, as if black women wish to have their embodied existence seen as equal to the embodied existence of the normative white male. But equality on these terms only reinforces the pre-established terms of normativity and the economy of privilege. This paradox of recognition politics is isomorphic with the dialectical tension inherent in the realities of race. And I'm going to put this in quotes because I like to say there's a double truth about the notion of race. I like to say that race is and race is not. Race is not insofar as it is a social construction. According to critical race theory, race is a myth, an ideological inscription used to perpetuate a hegemonic master narrative. There is no biological category called race. There's no black gene. Yet to deny the reality of race would be to participate in the hegemonic imagination that feeds the myth of colorblindness and the utopian notion of a so-called post-racial society. Indeed, race is not, and yet race very much is. Race is, insofar as embodied persons experience the lived reality of racialized identity. Race is a social reality with overwhelming significance when it comes to wage levels, unemployment levels, poverty levels, and the likelihood of incarceration. A phenomenological account of racial identity addresses the lived experience of persons whose bodies have been racialized at a given cultural moment. Yet to give a phenomenological account is not merely a descriptive act that accounts for what we all can see, but is rather to get us to apprehend the hidden reality of racialized subjects, its more sinister effects, and the power it has over our collective imagination. It is to disclose what we otherwise would not see, the body as non-written text, or to problematize what we otherwise would presume to be normal, the black urban male predator incarcerated. The presumption is that race exists as a perceivable and objective marker on the body. Linda Martine Alcoff tells us we tend to believe that A, there exists a fact of the matter about one's racial identity, usually determined by ancestry, and B, identity is discernible if one observes carefully enough or peers long enough at a person's physical features and practiced mannerisms. But the visible markers of race cannot be assessed as a biological entity. Using racial categories to direct biological research is, Alcoff says, like focusing the microscope on the box the slides came in. So the pithy saying that race is and race is not means that racial identity is not a product of race, as if this were a natural phenomenon or meaningful biological category, but is historically evolving and culturally contextual, and derived from the social construction of race, which is, among other things, also an epistemological, embodied, material practice. In order to understand human beings, it seems we need to order and classify them. And so we select categories to help us mark bodies so that we can order persons on the basis of observable scientific evidence, namely visible differences in identity. The problem is that difference of kind becomes read as difference in degree. Some humans are more human than others. From a presumably innocent or neutral social construction, racist hierarchies emerge as inevitable and seem inherent to the concept of race. Diversity is threatening because of liberal ideology that seeks universalistic concepts of justice based on sameness. For example, it's the argument against affirmative action in the United States that says everyone must be treated the same. Justice must be based on sameness. So there can be no preferential treatment of one group over another that is ever just. Of course, the problem is that bodies are racialized and treated differently long before they meet up with the question of so-called equal opportunity. So there's a contradiction at work. Alcoff calls it one of the greatest antinomies of modernism and a political paradox. The problem lies in holding together two contradictory notions. Humans can be classified on the basis of physical, moral, and intellectual human difference, and the universalism narrative that trivializes or even denies difference. So which is it? Are people different and subject to classification, or are people all the same? It seems that human bodies are classified in a way that puts black bodies at the bottom of the ranking system, and it seems that human bodies are regarded as all the same when the privileged position of white bodies in the ranking system is somehow threatened. So the contradictory ideologies of difference and sameness are a lose-lose for black bodies. The other problem with racial classification is that it operates on the basis of perceptual differences preceded by contextual knowledge. There is something that operates before differences are perceived that goes unacknowledged. As Alcoff puts it, there is no perception of the visible that is not already imbued with value. In other words, we do not perceive a black body as a neutral, objective fact. First, we attach value to blackness. Black signifies lack of beauty, lack of moral capacity, lack of intellectual ability. And then we see the body as black, which means when we classify the black body, we then attach to that body all that blackness means. In this case, putting it quite crudely, ugly, bad, and stupid. Racialized identity based on the visual registry is based on both the way we read ourselves and the way others read us. The criteria thought to determine racial identity has included ancestry, experience, self-understanding, habits, and practices. But all these sources are coded through visible inscriptions on the body. And this visual registry has been correlated with rational capacity, moral condition, and aesthetic value. The visual registry dominates body image as a habit of perception. Should we then stop seeing race? Should we unlearn racial seeing? The inevitability of racist hierarchies makes colorblindness an appealing alternative, even an apparent solution. No doubt to organize human beings according to visibly racialized identity is absurdly arbitrary, but to neglect the reality of this practice is inherently dangerous, Alcock says. Racialized identity cannot be shed like an animal sheds its skin, and is not fully reducible to its visible markers. Alcock argues there are at least two reasons why race needs to be seen. Race needs to be seen in order to see racism, and the ways in which race has distorted human identity, but also in order to acknowledge the positive sense of racial identity that has been carved from histories of oppression. Racial identity may have begun in oppression, but the experience of racialized identity is not always expressed as trauma or manifested as an antagonistic tribalism. Maybe we can, after all, resist a theology of suffering and oppression and resistance. This initial claim that racial identity may have begun in oppression is not taken for granted by philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah. Appiah argues that cultural differences of identity are formed as a consequence of conflict and are not the cause of conflict. Group identity is formed in the context of antagonistic relation. Understanding yourself as African American means resisting white norms, mainstream American conventions, the racism of white culture. Then why, he asks, should you at the same time seek recognition from these white others? Is it not enough to require or demand that one be treated with equal dignity it is not enough to require or demand that one be treated with equal dignity despite being black. For that would suggest that being black counts to some degree against one's dignity. And so one will end up asking to be respected as black. The question is whether the identities constructed in this way are ones we can be happy with in the longer run, demanding respect for persons as blacks, as gays, as women, as theologians, can go along with notably rigid structures and strictures as to how one is to be an African American or a person with same-sex desires. And he's speaking autobiographically because Appiah is an African American gay male. There will be proper modes of being black and gay. There will be demands that are made, expectations to be met, battle lines to be drawn. It is at this point, he says, that someone who takes autonomy seriously may worry whether we have replaced one kind of tyranny with another. Acts of recognition can sometimes ossify the identities that are their objects, because here a gaze turns to stone. Appiah calls this the Medusa syndrome. So there is the question of whether recognition ought to be a desired ideal, but also whether recognition is even ever possible. In fact, if otherness is constitutive of the self, then recognition is fundamentally impossible. Vulnerability before the other is not ideal in intersubjective relations. But there's another way to put the problem that may get us further along in the face of this paradox of recognition politics, and in light of the fact that the paradox does not thwart the struggle for recognition. Paul Ricoeur points out that the threat lies not in the paradox, but in forgetfulness. The threat lies in forgetting dissymmetry. The struggle for recognition is not that of misrecognizing someone, but rather that of misrecognizing the asymmetry in the relation between me and the other. Forgetting this asymmetry would constitute the ultimate misrecognition. The whole phenomenological enterprise is called into question if it tries to get beyond this originary asymmetry between the self and others. This means that the task does not lie in trying to overcome dissymmetry, but now it is just the opposite. How to integrate dissymmetry in order to make sense of justice in the process of recognition. Ricoeur insists that the discovery of this forgetfulness about dissymmetry is what matters most for recognition. So I'd like to argue that revelation, revealing the quotidian, the uninterrogated, the invisible, all of these things that go unrecognized, that revelation then becomes a critical starting point for womanist theology. And this is true for two essential reasons. First, the reality of multiple oppressions intersecting on Black women's bodies is born of and lives by covert ideological discourse. Human oppression is, of course, quite often unabashedly overt. Examples both extant and throughout history abound. But the insidious effect of covert oppression requires the unveiling of its modes of concealment. The second reason is a corollary to the first. A womanist hermeneutic of revelation must ground the reality that God has been revealed to and through Black women is itself contested and therefore warrants revelation. Covert ideologies have quite successfully hidden this fact from view. For these reasons, we may say the raison d'etre of womanist theology is the call to reveal, to render this fact of covert ideology a revealed reality, and to discover what divine revelation has to say about it. From a Christian theological perspective, a womanist sees the Christ event as a revelatory kenosis, a self-emptying, but not in the sense of self-abnegation or self-sacrifice, but rather a kenosis of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, to use Bell Hook's phrase, that dehumanizes the exploited, despised poor women of color. Queering the flesh of Christ, as womanist Sean Copeland discusses, is subversive of the anthropocentric and masculinist ways of being human. Revelation is both theologically and politically productive, for a theology of race and gender is about the task of rendering visible that which otherwise remains invisible, the insidious and covert nature of oppressive discourse. Revelation is about the work of saturating the visual field with what has been concealed because of either misrepresentation or non-representation or the hypervisibility and invisibility of Black women's bodies. Revelation is necessary to counter the historical practice of occlusion of Black women's bodies and the scandal of flesh. There are obvious political and ethical reasons for redefining identity away from exclusion, but there's also a theological reason. When we do violence to Black women's subjectivity, we betray not only the humanity of Black women, not only the humanity of human beings in general, but as womanist Sean Copeland so powerfully reminds us, we betray the humanity of God. Thank you.